I want to tell you about the moment a man cut $35,000 from my salary, looked me in the eye, and smiled. It was not a grand gesture, and it was not the sort of display that fills a room with noise. It was small, controlled, the kind of expression that silently communicates that one person holds all the leverage, and both parties in the room are fully aware of it. His name was Bradley Thorne. He was the chief executive officer of Apex Integration Systems, the company I had dedicated 14 years of my life to supporting. Bradley was 43 years old, always dressed in a jacket that fit with tailored precision, and maintained a haircut that cost more than most people would spend on a monthly car payment. He possessed a ready explanation for everything and harbored doubt about nothing. Whenever he stepped into a space, he made sure everyone understood he was the most significant presence in it. I was 54. My name is Alan Vance, and on a Tuesday morning in April, I sat across from Bradley in his corner office on the fourth floor and listened to him take apart my financial stability with the same casual energy most people use when ordering their midday meal. I remember the room with absolute clarity. A long glass window behind his modern desk looked out over the parking lot below, where the morning light sat flat and gray. His desk was almost completely bare, featuring only a closed laptop and a small silver pen that he kept rotating between his fingers while he spoke. He had folded his hands before starting, like a man who had rehearsed his speech several times. He told me the decision was about restructuring. He used terms like performance realignment and corporate optimization. He explained that the company needed to make strategic adjustments to its compensation structure across senior roles to remain competitive in the logistics market. It sounded clean and highly professional, like something a public relations team would write for a press release. Then he stated the number. My base salary, which had been $150,000, was being reduced to $115,000, effective on the first of the coming month. $35,000 disappeared with a single phrase and the turn of a pen. I sat with that statement for a long moment. I did not move. I did not allow my facial expression to change. I have worked in corporate environments long enough to understand that displaying pain in a room like that is equivalent to handing the other person a weapon. So, I asked him one single question, asking if this decision was final. He nodded and said it was, and then he leaned back slightly in his leather chair, that small smile appearing on his face. He said he hoped I would understand the bigger picture of where the company was heading. It felt as though he believed he was doing me a favor by explaining the shape of the hole he had just carved out of my life. I nodded in response. I thanked him for his time. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I did not request time to think or plead for reconsideration, nor did I tell him what I actually thought of his corporate picture. I walked out calmly, chose the stairs instead of the elevator, and returned to my desk. What Bradley Thorne did not know, and could not have known, was that in the inside pocket of the jacket I was wearing that morning sat a folded document. It was a signed offer letter from Summit Logistics Software, a direct competitor of Apex Integration Systems. That letter offered me a base salary of $198,000 per year. It included a clear performance bonus structure, equity participation, and comprehensive medical benefits. I had signed that letter 6 days earlier on a Thursday night, sitting at my own kitchen table. So, while Bradley Thorne sat in his corner office, believing he had just put an aging employee in his place, the truth was already decided. The door was already open, and I had already stepped through it. All that remained was the paperwork. He cut my salary by $35,000 and smiled, having absolutely no idea. That moment is where this story truly begins. Not in his office, not with his smile, and not with his polished words about restructuring. It begins with a man who had spent 14 years making himself indispensable to a company, who had watched that company slowly stop seeing him, who had quietly built a path to the outside, and who sat in silence while his supervisor unknowingly handed him the cleanest exit he could have ever requested. My name is Alan Vance, and this is how the entire system fell apart because they forgot to look at what was holding it up. I am not the kind of man who is easy to notice. I do not walk into rooms with the presence of Bradley Thorne. I do not lead with volume or performance. I lead with work. I grew up in a working-class family in Ohio. My father worked in manufacturing for 32 years, and my mother managed every dollar that came through our household. I learned early that the people who keep things running are rarely the ones standing at the front getting the applause. They are in the back, ensuring the structure does not collapse. My work at Apex Integration Systems was focused entirely on systems integration, which is the highly specialized process of connecting different logistics platforms so that critical business information moves between them without error. It sounds like a simple matter when described in a high-level corporate meeting, but in reality, it is incredibly complex. When integrations fail, businesses lose tracking data, lose revenue, and lose client trust. When they work perfectly, nobody notices anything at all, which is exactly how it should be. I joined Apex when I was 40 years old, 14 years ago. The company builds and sells integration software to mid-size freight and distribution businesses that move physical goods across the country. These are not glamorous tech companies, but they are essential businesses running on real databases. Over 14 years, I became the only person who understood how every major client system connected to ours. I knew which clients ran older database structures that required custom translations, and I knew the undocumented workarounds we had built years ago to keep them running. I was the institutional memory of the integration division, the one who solved problems before they became crises. To paint a clearer picture, systems integration at this level means writing custom communication layers that sit between incompatible database architectures. A trucking firm might be running a database system from the late 90s, while a modern distributor uses a cloud-based platform. My role was to write the custom scripts that translate the data fields in real time, ensuring that a shipment of medical supplies or machine parts is not delayed due to a database syntax error. Over my 14 years at the company, I built over 40 of these custom integrations, each one specifically tailored to the unique operational quirks of our clients. When these systems run without a hitch, it is because of the thousands of hours of quiet testing and patching I performed, most of which was never formally logged in our company database because the managers only cared about the final sale, not the underlying code. Outside of the office, I had personal responsibilities that made my salary matter immensely to the stability of my household. My wife, Clara, had been working part-time for the past 3 years following a major health issue that required surgery and a long recovery period. She was recovering well, but we were still rebuilding our finances and paying off medical bills. Our daughter, Rachel, was in her second year at a state university, and her tuition, housing, and books were entirely our responsibility. We also had a mortgage on our home that we had purchased 16 years ago, with 6 years of payments remaining. When Bradley Thorne cut my salary by $35,000, he was not just adjusting a cell on a corporate spreadsheet. He was removing the financial buffer that allowed my family to sleep peacefully at night. He did it with a smile and a clinical phrase, without caring what those numbers represented in the real world. That is what I want people to understand. This was not a matter of pride or ego. It was about a mortgage, a daughter's education, and a wife recovering her strength. It was about the real cost of a CEO's disregard. To understand why Bradley's decision backfired so spectacularly, you have to understand what Apex looked like before his arrival. The company was founded by George Albright, a practical man who started Apex in a small office with one client and grew it steadily. By the time I joined, George had grown it to 200 employees and a stable client list. George was not flashy. He was direct and fair, and he trusted the technicians who proved their worth over years of service. He did not care about corporate buzzwords. He cared about client satisfaction and keeping the systems running. George retired 10 years ago, gradually selling his equity to the board. His departure left a vacuum that the board eventually filled with Bradley Thorne. Bradley arrived with credentials that impressed the board, including a business degree from a top school and experience at 2 software companies. He was young, articulate, and obsessed with efficiency, modernization, and reducing operating costs. Within 2 months, Bradley made his priorities clear, stating he wanted a leaner organization populated by people who thought like owners. I soon realized that thinking like an owner meant looking and sounding like Bradley. He began surrounding himself with young managers who had business backgrounds but lacked technical experience. The one who rose fastest was Julian Miller. Julian joined Apex 10 months before my salary cut. He was 34 years old, had a master's degree, and possessed almost no experience with complex integration systems. Yet, within 4 months of his arrival, Bradley appointed Julian to lead our integration modernization initiative, and within 6 months, Julian became my supervisor. A man who had been with the company for less than a year, who had never managed a large client integration, and who privately asked me basic questions about database mapping, was now my boss. I said nothing. I did my job and answered his questions. But I noticed when Julian presented a modernization report to Bradley that was copied directly from documentation I had written, with my name completely removed. I was being quietly erased by people who did not understand the systems they were supposed to manage, and I knew it was only a matter of time before their lack of knowledge caught up with them. I was not looking for a new role when Evelyn Ward reached out to me on a professional networking site on a Wednesday afternoon. Evelyn had worked at Apex for 3 years before leaving 2 years prior, and she was sharp and direct. She was now heading talent acquisition at Summit Logistics Software, and she wanted to know if I had 30 minutes to talk. Summit was a direct competitor of Apex, and they had recently secured significant capital to expand their enterprise integration division. They did not need managers who talked about systems. They needed engineers who had built them. My technical interviews with Summit lasted 3 weeks, covering database failures, custom APIs, and legacy system compatibility. I answered every question with the depth of my 14 years of experience, and the written offer for $198,000 arrived shortly after. I signed it at my kitchen table, planning to give Apex 3 weeks of notice while organizing my documentation. Evelyn explained that Summit had watched Apex's recent shift toward management-heavy teams with growing interest. They saw an opportunity to capture Apex's market share by offering superior technical support and direct developer access to clients. She told me that Summit's leadership team believed the key to winning in the logistics space was not having the best-dressed sales representatives, but having the most robust and reliable integration software. That philosophy resonated with me immediately. During the 3 weeks of interviews, I spoke with senior architects at Summit, who asked deep questions about low-level system design. They wanted to know how I would handle a sudden database lockup during a high-volume shipping window, or how I would resolve character encoding issues between legacy mainframes and modern APIs. It was a refreshing change from the empty corporate buzzwords I had been hearing from Bradley and Julian. But before I could resign, Bradley Thorne called me in and cut my salary, presenting me with a document he called a proprietary rights assignment. Apex had been using an integration engine called the Vance Bridge, a software middleware tool I had written in my spare time before joining the company. Under my original employment contract with George Albright, I retained the copyright to the Vance Bridge, licensing it to Apex under a non-exclusive agreement. Bradley wanted me to sign a document transferring all intellectual property rights of the Vance Bridge to Apex for zero compensation. When I refused, Bradley smiled and told me that my refusal would affect my future at the company, leading directly to the salary cut. What I did not discover until later was that Bradley, desperate to show the board that Apex owned the proprietary core of their client systems, to justify Julian's modernization budget, forged my signature on that assignment document. The Vance Bridge was a proprietary piece of software I had spent nearly 2 years designing and coding, long before I ever walked through the doors of Apex. It was a modular integration framework that allowed different systems to exchange information at high speeds, using a custom caching mechanism I had developed. When I was hired, George Albright recognized the value of this software and agreed that the intellectual property rights would remain entirely mine. We signed a licensing agreement that permitted Apex to use the Vance Bridge in their client systems in exchange for a separate licensing fee, and the understanding that I retained complete ownership of the code. Bradley's attempt to force me to sign away these rights was not just a minor corporate dispute. It was a hostile takeover of my personal intellectual property. That forgery would become the legal weapon that destroyed Bradley's plans. Under California Penal Code Section 470, forging a signature on a legal contract is a criminal offense, rendering the document void ab initio, meaning it was invalid from the very beginning. Furthermore, because the assignment was void, Apex's continued distribution and use of the Vance Bridge in their client systems constituted federal copyright infringement under Title 17, United States Code, Section 106. I walked back to my desk with the signed summit offer in my pocket, knowing that Bradley had not only cut my salary, but had also crossed a dangerous legal line. I spent the remainder of the day organizing my personal files and preparing my departure, ensuring that every step of my exit would be handled by my attorney. I was ready to leave, and I was ready to let the law do the work. As I sat at my desk that afternoon, I realized the full implications of what Bradley had done. By forging my signature, he had attempted to steal the work I had spent years developing, all to satisfy his corporate ego and justify Julian's promotion. But he had also handed me the perfect legal recourse. I contacted my attorney, a sharp specialist in intellectual property, and explained the situation. He confirmed that we had a clear, undeniable case of copyright infringement and fraud. We decided to hold our position until my resignation was complete. I would serve my 3 weeks of notice, allowing Apex to believe they had successfully pressured me while we prepared the formal legal documents. The trap was set, and Bradley had walked right into it, completely unaware that his short-sighted greed had placed his entire company in legal jeopardy. I wrote my resignation letter on Monday morning, keeping the text concise and professional. I confirmed my last day would be 3 weeks from that date, offering no explanation and making no mention of the salary reduction. I sent the email to Human Resources and copied Bradley Thorne. Bradley did not respond for 4 hours. When he finally approached my workspace, he stood there looking unsettled and remarked that he had not seen this coming. I simply told him I understood, refusing to engage in the debate he wanted. Over the next 3 weeks, the office atmosphere shifted. The technicians on my team, including Walter, who had worked with me for 6 years, sensed that something was wrong. Julian Miller began appearing at my desk multiple times a day with urgent questions. He asked about database access, credential rotations, and client configurations. In those 15 days, Julian came to my desk 14 times, his confidence replaced by quiet desperation. I printed 3 physical copies of the resignation letter and signed each one in blue ink. I kept 1 copy for my own personal records, placed one in a sealed envelope on Bradley's empty desk, and handed the 3rd copy directly to the Human Resources Director. The atmosphere in the office during those 3 weeks was thick with tension. Walter, who had worked in the cubicle next to mine for 6 years and had helped me resolve countless system issues, knew that my departure meant the end of an era. He asked me quietly if the company had tried to make me a counteroffer, and I told him the truth. They had only tried to take what was mine. Julian Miller's visits to my desk became increasingly frantic. He would stand at the edge of my workspace, nervously tapping his pen against his folder, and ask questions that showed he had no understanding of the basic files he was supposed to manage. He asked how the servers handled database load balancing, how the API keys were rotated, and where the master configuration files were stored. He was trying to absorb 14 years of knowledge in 15 days, and it was clear to both of us that it was impossible. The cracks in the system appeared quickly. 5 days after my resignation, the integration for Oak Ridge Freight Lines, our top revenue client, failed. The issue was connected to a legacy database shift that disrupted the custom compatibility patch I had written. Julian could not resolve it, and the IT department was helpless. When they called me, I explained the solution over the phone in 20 minutes, but the client was furious that a critical system had stalled. Next, the IT department tried to migrate the database credentials for our client onboarding pipeline away from my administrator account. I had built the pipeline to run through a specific sequence. The IT team spent 5 days trying to reverse engineer it, realizing that if they made one mistake, the entire pipeline would lock up. They finally had to ask me for the sequence document, which I provided. Meanwhile, An internal compliance audit began examining our active client contracts, highlighting the non-standard terms I had negotiated. The failure of the Oak Ridge Freight Line's integration was a direct result of Julian's attempt to update the database configuration without understanding the custom patch. He had run an automated migration script that wiped out the custom translation rules I had written, causing their inventory system to mismatch with our shipping logs. Within an hour of the update, Oak Ridge's distribution centers in 3 states were unable to print shipping labels, and trucks were sitting idle at the docks. The panicking operations director at Oak Ridge called Julian, who tried to blame a network latency issue. When they finally escalated the call to me, I logged in, located the backup file of the custom patch, and restored the translation rules, resolving the issue in 20 minutes. But the damage to Apex's reputation was already done. The Oak Ridge team knew that Julian had no idea how to fix his own system, and they knew that I was the only reason their operations had resumed. During my final week, Bradley Thorne called me into his office once more. He looked tired, the confident smile entirely absent. He asked if there was any amount of money that would convince me to stay. I told him my decision was final, and I walked out. On my last Friday, I submitted my completed handoff documentation, packed my coffee mug, my family photo, and my notebooks, and said goodbye to Walter and the technicians. I sat in my driveway for 5 minutes when I got home, feeling the weight of 14 years lift from my shoulders. When I walked inside, I sat at the kitchen table and told Clara everything, including the salary cut. She sat quietly for a moment, then placed her hand over mine and wept. It was a release of years of tension, the relief of knowing that we were finally free from the constant pressure of a company that did not value what I brought to the table. As the door of Apex closed behind me for the last time, I felt a profound sense of closure. The years of quiet dedication, the long nights spent fixing database errors, and the frustration of being managed by people who did not understand the technology were all in the past. I knew the coming weeks would be chaotic for Bradley and Julian as they struggled to maintain the systems without my guidance, but my focus was now on the future. I was joining Summit Logistics Software, a company that valued my expertise and was willing to pay me what I was worth. I had protected my family, secured my daughter's education, and stood up for my rights. The legal battle was about to begin, but I was entering it from a position of strength, supported by my family and a clear conscience. The aftermath began 3 weeks after my departure. My attorney sent a formal cease and desist letter to Apex Integration Systems, accompanied by proof of the forged signature on the proprietary rights assignment. The letter cited California Penal Code Section 470, declaring the assignment void, and demanded that Apex immediately cease all use of the Vance Bridge, referencing our rights under Title 17, United States Code, Section 106. When the board of directors received the letter, they panicked. The legal department confirmed that if the document was forged, Apex was facing massive copyright infringement liability. Bradley Thorne was suspended immediately pending an internal investigation. Because Apex could not legally run the Vance Bridge without my consent, they had to halt several core system integrations, which caused Oak Ridge Freight Line systems to fail once again. My attorney's cease and desist letter was accompanied by a forensic analysis of the signature on the copyright assignment document, which showed clear indicators of digital tracing and forgery. The board of directors, consisting of 7 members who had trusted Bradley's reports, called an emergency meeting on a Sunday afternoon. They realized that Bradley's actions had exposed Apex to millions of dollars in statutory damages under federal copyright law, and that their top client accounts were running on unlicensed softwares. The suspension of Bradley Thorne was announced to the entire company on Monday morning, and the legal department immediately began reviewing every contract Bradley had signed during his tenure. Because they were legally prohibited from using the Vance Bridge, they had to disable the integration modules for their top accounts, which immediately halted the automated data sync for Oak Ridge Freight Lines and 4 other major distributors. Oak Ridge Freight Lines did not wait. Their operations director contacted Apex and demanded that they either resolve the legal dispute or face a lawsuit for breach of contract. Oak Ridge also reached out to me directly, asking if I would return as an independent consultant at a rate of $300 per hour to stabilize their systems. I agreed, signing a consulting contract that Apex had to fund. Within a month, Julian Miller stepped down from his management position and the board began restructuring the integration department. Bradley Thorne was officially terminated, and the company is currently negotiating a settlement with my legal counsel to avoid a public federal copyright lawsuit. I did not watch this collapse with anger or joy. I was busy with my new role at Summit Logistics Software, where my salary of $198,000 is secure, and where my expertise is respected. The consulting contract I signed with Apex, through my attorney, was structured with a minimum guarantee of 40 hours per week, at the rate of $300 per hour, paid in advance. This meant that while I was starting my new job at Summit Logistics Software, Apex was paying me $12,000 a week just to remain on call and resolve integration errors. Julian Miller's departure was quiet. He was allowed to resign to avoid being fired for his failure to manage the transition. The settlement negotiations between my legal counsel and Apex are moving toward a final agreement that includes a substantial licensing fee for their past unauthorized use of my software, along with a complete release of any claims. Bradley's career in the logistics software industry is effectively over, as the board is preparing to turn the evidence of forgery over to the local district attorney's office. It has been 5 months since I walked out of Apex Integration Systems. I have had time to reflect on those 14 years. I spent over a decade making myself indispensable, but I made the mistake of making myself invisible. Indispensable means they need your work. Visible means they see your value. When someone shows you what you are worth to them, you must believe them. Do not wait for them to change. Bradley Thorne cut my salary and smiled, believing I had no options, but he only succeeded in exposing his own vulnerability and the fragility of the system he ran. Today, my daughter's university tuition is paid, our mortgage is secure, and Clara is healthy. I work in a place where my contributions are recognized and my name is known. That is not a minor victory, it is everything. I walked away from a cold office on the 4th floor and found my value, and no corporate smile can ever take that away from me again. Looking back, I realized that the true victory was not the financial settlement or the consulting fees, though they certainly helped secure my family's future. The true victory was reclaiming my agency. In the corporate world, it is easy to become a cog in the machine, to accept mistreatment because of the fear of change. But when I stood up to Bradley and invoked the protection of California Penal Code, Section 470 and federal copyright law under Title 17, United States Code, Section 106, I reminded myself that my skills belong to me. A company can hire your labor, but they do not own your intellect unless you choose to give it to them. I chose to take mine with me, and in doing so, I showed my family and myself that dignity is something you never sacrifice for a paycheck.